So, what happens when a society, one that was really built on Christian ideas, decides it doesn't need a king anymore? I mean, a divine king. Today, we're diving deep into the work of theologian Oliver O'Donovan. We're going to try to understand what he calls the end of Christendom, and more importantly, what it means for the Church's mission right now, wherever we happen to find ourselves. Let's get into it.
Right out of the gate, O'Donovan hits us with this bombshell. He argues that in the effort to protect the Church from the state, we accidentally declared the state was somehow off-limits to the gospel. Just let that sink in. This single idea really forces us to rethink almost everything we assume about faith and politics.
So here's our roadmap. First, we'll define exactly what O'Donovan thinks was lost with Christendom. Then, we'll look at the fallout, a state without Christ, and what he calls a headless society. From there, we'll explore O'Donovan's constructive solution, and finally, we'll bring it all home to ask, okay, what does any of this mean for ministry right here in Nigeria?
Okay, let's start with O'Donovan's big idea, Christendom. And we need to be really clear here. He's not talking about some perfect, romanticized golden age, not at all. He's talking about a fundamental public belief, a core assumption, that he believes is now completely vanished.
You see, at its heart, the idea was actually pretty simple. Political power wasn't the final word. Every king, every ruler, every president, they all had a boss, and that boss was the risen and reigning Christ. They were publicly, openly accountable to a higher authority. It meant the prime minister had to answer to the King of Kings.
But O'Donovan says that era is over, it's done. Today, the ideal we all hear about is the neutral state. The government isn't supposed to be hostile, not necessarily, but it also offers no help, no special acknowledgement of the Church's mission. And it's that shift from accountability to supposed neutrality that changes absolutely everything.
So, where did this new idea really get locked into place? Well, O'Donovan points to a very specific moment as the symbolic end of Christendom, the writing of the United States First Amendment. This is where this whole new way of thinking was formally written into law.
And this really lays out the stark contrast, doesn't it? On the one hand, you have the Christendom idea, rulers are accountable to Christ. And on the other, the modern idea, the state basically claims it has zero responsibility to acknowledge God's authority at all. It's like a declaration of independence from the King of the universe.
And O'Donovan does not mince words here. He calls this idea exactly what it is from a theological point of view: heresy. You know, to say that any part of creation, especially something as powerful as political authority, is exempt from Christ's reign, well, that directly contradicts the creed we confess every Sunday: of his kingdom there will be no end.
And this, right here, is the great, tragic paradox. The intention, for many well-meaning Christians at the time, was to free the Church from government meddling. But O'Donovan argues the actual result was the exact opposite. It didn't just free the Church, it effectively silenced its public voice and pushed Christianity into the corner of private, personal opinion.
Now, this political change created a huge ripple effect. It didn't just change how we see government, it changed how we see society itself. It led to what O'Donovan calls a demoralized society, one that has literally lost its guiding moral purpose, its head.
Acephalous, it's a technical word, but it just means headless. Once a society removes Christ as its ultimate authority, it stops seeing itself as a community bound together by a shared moral purpose. It becomes something more like a complex machine, or an organism, just driven by internal forces like the economy or power struggles, but with no real guiding conscience.
And this headless view isn't just an abstract concept, it has very real consequences. First, society becomes a thing for experts to manage, not a community for leaders to guide. Second, even while it pretends to be neutral, the state is still making ultimate judgments about good and evil. It just won't admit it. And finally, the very idea of a shared public justice, it just starts to crumble. See, in place of a shared vision of what's right, we get this constant battle of what O'Donovan calls subjective rights. The idea today is that every person, every group, just shows up with their own non-negotiable list of rights. So what we call justice becomes this endless, messy negotiation between competing claims, instead of all of us trying to align ourselves with a common divine standard of what is good and true.
So, after he tears down this modern view, O'Donovan doesn't just leave us sitting in the rubble. He turns to rebuilding, and he asks this radical question. What if the gospel story itself, what if that gives us the actual blueprint for a truly healthy society?
This is really the heart of his alternative vision. Instead of that aimless, headless organism we just talked about,
What would a society look like if its fundamental assumptions were shaped by the actual story of Jesus, his life, his death, his resurrection, and his ascension?
O'Donovan sketches out this amazing four-part structure drawn right from the gospel narrative. True freedom isn't a political achievement. It's rooted in Christ's liberating work. Our idea of justice gets transformed into merciful judgment by the cross. The goodness of creation and the natural order of things is confirmed by the resurrection. And our public square is opened up for free, truthful speech because of the power of the Spirit at Pentecost. Now, this is a really crucial point. O'Donovan is not arguing for a theocracy. He's not saying we should turn the nation into the church. He uses this beautiful image of a penumbra, like the partial shadow in an eclipse. A gospel-shaped society isn't the church itself, but it lives in the light that shines from the church. It's influenced by it, claimed for the kingdom.
And that brings us to the most important part for us today. How does this deep theological dive into Western history actually apply to our context? How do we take these big ideas and use them in our ministries for our nation right here in Nigeria?
The key, I think, is to see O'Donovan's work not as a history lesson about America or Europe, but as a set of diagnostic tools. These are tools that can help us ask sharper, more critical, more biblically informed questions about our own society, its politics, and its understanding of justice.
So let's start asking those questions. O'Donovan is passionate that the church's mission has a political frontier, a duty to call rulers and systems to obedience to Christ, not just individuals. So what does that political frontier look like for the church in Nigeria right now?
Or take his idea of merciful judgment. Our nation is crying out, and rightly so, for justice against corruption and evil. But what is the church's unique word into that cry? How can our ministries actually model a kind of justice that isn't just about punishment or revenge, but is about the powerful, reconciling judgment that we see at the cross of Christ?
O'Donovan leaves us with this very sobering quote from Gregory the Great. The implication is, well, it's stark. There's a direct link between the spiritual and moral health of a people and the kind of government they end up with. And that, my friends, places a huge responsibility right on the shoulders of the church as the salt and light of the nation.
So we end with this final challenge. If society is not meant to be a headless, aimless organism, but a community that can only find its true purpose under the authority of Christ, then what is our specific prophetic task? What must the church in Nigeria say, and even more importantly, what must it be, for the good of this nation and for the glory of our King? That is the urgent question O'Donovan's work forces us all to face.